I didn't notice the day my children stopped visiting. That might sound strange. You would think something like that would arrive clearly, like a date on a calendar or a conversation you could point to later and say, that was the moment things changed. But it didn't happen that way. It happened slowly. Quietly. In the kind of way changes often happen inside families, one ordinary weekend at a time until something you used to expect becomes something you begin to wonder about. For a long time, I believed they were just busy. And maybe they were. Life has a way of becoming crowded when you're raising children of your own, building careers, trying to keep up with bills and schedules and responsibilities that never seemed quite as heavy when I was their age. Still, there was a time when weekends meant something different in our house. Saturday mornings used to begin early. Earlier than I would have chosen if I'd had the choice. When my son and daughter were young, they woke before the sun sometimes. Not because they had anywhere to be, but because children carry their energy like something they can't quite hold inside themselves. They would come down the hallway in their socks, whispering loudly in the way children think counts as whispering, already planning what the day might become. My daughter always went straight to the kitchen. She liked routines. Even when she was small, she liked knowing what came next. She would stand beside me while I made pancakes and ask the same questions every Saturday morning as if the answers might change if she asked them often enough. "Can I flip one today?" "You can try," I would say. Most of the time she flipped them too early. Or too late. Sometimes they landed folded over themselves in strange shapes that made her laugh harder than they should have. My son was different. He didn't care about the pancakes as much as he cared about what came after breakfast. "Are we doing something today?" he would ask while he ate. "We always do something," I told him once. He liked that answer so much he repeated it for years. We always do something. Sometimes, something meant the hardware store. Sometimes it meant a walk through the park near the school where they would run ahead and then come back again just to make sure I was still behind them. Sometimes it meant nothing more than cleaning the garage together while music played from a radio that never quite picked up the stations clearly. None of those mornings felt important at the time. They felt ordinary. Routine. Predictable. And that is exactly what made them important. Sundays were quieter. Their mother preferred Sundays to be slower. There was always coffee on the table longer than it needed to be. Someone always forgot to clear the dishes. Someone always sat a little longer than they intended before getting up to start whatever came next. Those were the mornings when conversation lasted the longest. Not because anyone planned it that way. Because there was nowhere else we needed to be. I used to think houses remembered things. Not in the way people do. Not exactly. But in quieter ways. The hallway where backpacks used to land after school. The kitchen table where homework spread out like something permanent. The stairs where someone always sat halfway down instead of going all the way up. Those places carried the shape of our lives inside them. Even now, when I walk through the house in the evening, I sometimes still expect to hear footsteps behind me. For many years, weekends meant visits even after they moved out. Not the same visits as before. But visits. My daughter would arrive first most of the time. She liked coming earlier in the day when the light still came through the front windows and made the living room feel warmer than it really was. She always brought something with her. Not because she needed to. Because she thought she should. A loaf of bread from the bakery near her apartment. Flowers she said were on sale even when I knew they probably weren't. Sometimes nothing more than a bag she had already been carrying somewhere else. "I thought I'd stop by," she would say. As if the stopping by had not already been part of her plan. My son came later in the afternoon. Usually after he had finished whatever he was working on that weekend. He never arrived empty-handed either. Sometimes tools he thought I might need. Sometimes a story about something that had happened during the week that he hadn't had time to explain on the phone. Sometimes nothing at all except the quiet way he stepped into the house like he still belonged there. We never made announcements when they arrived. No one needed to. The house changed when they came in. It always did. The kitchen sounded different. The living room filled more quickly. Even the hallway felt less empty. There was a rhythm to those visits. Coffee first. Conversation that began slowly and stretched itself out across the afternoon. Dinner sometimes. Not always planned. Often decided in the middle of a sentence when someone realized no one had eaten yet. Those afternoons passed the same way seasons do, without anyone noticing exactly when one ended and another began. Then, little by little, something changed. At first, the visits moved slightly later. My daughter began arriving closer to lunchtime instead of mid-morning. My son started coming after dinner instead of before it. None of that felt unusual. People grow older. Schedules become fuller. Responsibilities take up more room than they used to. I understood that. Then one weekend passed without a visit at all. That wasn't unusual either. Not at first. There were always weekends like that. Trips. Work. Things that couldn't be moved. I spent that Saturday the same way I always did. Coffee in the morning. A walk in the afternoon. The radio playing in the kitchen while I cleaned things that didn't really need cleaning. It wasn't until Sunday evening that I noticed something small. I had set 3 plates on the table without thinking. It was something I had done for years. Something my hands remembered even when my mind didn't ask them to. When I realized what I had done, I stood there for a moment longer than I expected to. Then I put 2 of the plates back in the cupboard. The next weekend passed the same way. Quiet. Ordinary. Unremarkable. There were phone calls. Messages. Short conversations that ended with the same sentence. We should get together soon. I believed those sentences. There was no reason not to. Families say things like that all the time. And most of the time they mean them. But weeks have a way of becoming months when no one is watching closely enough. One afternoon I found myself standing in my daughter's old room longer than I meant to. I had gone in to open the window. Nothing more. The curtains still moved the same way they always had when the air came through. Her bookshelf still held the same arrangement of paperbacks she never wanted to throw away. There was a small scratch on the desk near the corner where she used to sit and study. I remembered when that happened. She had dropped something heavy without meaning to and spent 10 minutes apologizing as if furniture could be offended. I ran my hand across that scratch without thinking. Then I stepped back into the hallway and closed the door. Later that evening, I checked the calendar on the wall in the kitchen. Not because I was expecting anything. Because I suddenly realized I couldn't remember the last time both of them had been in the house together. I stood there looking at the empty squares of the coming weeks. And for the first time, I allowed myself to wonder whether something had changed in a way I hadn't fully noticed yet. After that evening when I stood in the kitchen looking at the calendar longer than I needed to, I began noticing the house differently. Not in a dramatic way. Nothing had moved. Nothing had broken. Nothing had disappeared. But something about the space between things felt wider. For many years I never thought about how much of family life happens without planning. People come in through the front door while you are still in the middle of something else. Someone opens the refrigerator and asks what there is to eat. Someone sits down at the table before anyone else is ready. Voices overlap in the hallway because 2 conversations are happening at the same time. You don't notice those things when they are happening. You only notice when they stop. The following Saturday morning, I woke earlier than usual. Not because there was anything I needed to do. Because my body still remembered the rhythm of weekends the way they used to be. I made coffee the same way I always had. 2 spoons of sugar in the jar even though no one else used sugar anymore. 3 mugs placed on the counter before I realized what I was doing. It took me a moment to understand why I had done that. I stood there holding one of the extra mugs in my hand longer than I should have. Then I put it back in the cupboard. I carried my coffee to the kitchen table and sat down where I always sat when they were younger. From that chair, I could see the front door clearly. I had never chosen that seat on purpose. It had simply become mine over the years. Without thinking, I found myself listening for something. The sound of the handle turning. The quick knock my son always gave even when the door was unlocked. The way my daughter used to call out before she was fully inside the house. "Are you home?" Of course I was home. Still, she always asked. That morning there was only the sound of the refrigerator running quietly in the corner, and the clock on the wall reminding me how slowly time can move when there is no one else inside the room. Later that afternoon, I decided to go to the grocery store. Not because I needed anything in particular. Because it was something I had always done on Saturdays. For years I bought more than I needed without thinking about it. Extra bread. More fruit than I could finish myself. Coffee I didn't really need to replace yet. I told myself it was habit. But I knew what the habit was for. In the checkout line, I noticed the woman in front of me buying enough food for what looked like a large family. 2 cartons of milk. Several boxes of cereal. A bag of apples that would not last long in a quiet house. I realized then that my basket looked different than it used to. Smaller. Lighter. More careful. When I came home, I unpacked everything slowly. The kitchen stayed quiet while I worked. That evening, my daughter called. "I'm sorry I didn't stop by this weekend," she said. "That's all right," I told her. "I had a lot to do," she continued. "I understand." And I did. She told me about work. About something her neighbor had said that made her laugh. About a trip she might take later in the year if she could find the time. We talked for a while. Long enough that the conversation felt comfortable again. But when the call ended, the house returned to the same stillness it had before it rang. The next week passed quickly. There were small things to do around the house. A fence that needed fixing. Papers I had been meaning to organize. A drawer in the hallway that no longer closed properly unless you lifted it slightly before pushing. Those kinds of tasks fill time without asking much from you. Still, I noticed something else during those days. I stopped expecting visits without realizing I had stopped expecting them. That change happened quietly. Almost politely. One afternoon, my son called. "Hey," he said. "Hi," I answered. "I've been meaning to come by," he told me. "You don't have to explain," I said. "I know," he replied. "It's just been busy." "I remember busy," I said. He laughed a little at that. "I'll try to stop by next weekend," he added. "That would be nice." When the call ended, I sat in the living room for a while without turning on the television. The light from the window moved slowly across the floor the way it always did in the late afternoon. I thought about something I hadn't thought about clearly before. There had been a time when they came without telling me they were coming. They simply arrived. And now they told me they might. That was not a complaint. It was simply a difference. Later that evening, I opened the cabinet where we used to keep the extra plates. For years I had kept enough there for everyone without thinking about it. I still did. Even though I knew most weekends those plates would stay exactly where they were. I took one of them down and set it on the table beside mine before dinner. Not because anyone was coming. Because I remembered how the table used to look when someone else sat across from me. I left it there longer than I needed to. After dinner, I washed both plates and put them away again. A few days later, I found an old photo album in the hallway closet. It had been pushed toward the back behind things I no longer used very often. I carried it into the living room and sat down with it on my lap. The first pages held pictures from years I could barely believe had passed so quickly. My daughter standing in the yard with a ribbon in her hair she refused to take out even after it started to come loose. My son holding a toy truck he insisted on bringing everywhere for almost an entire summer. There were pictures from birthday parties, school events, evenings when no one remembered why we had taken a photograph except that someone had said, "Stand closer together." I turned the pages slowly. Not because I was trying to remember something specific. Because the photographs reminded me how often they used to be here. How natural it once felt to expect their voices in the hallway without thinking about it. That night, before I went to bed, I walked through the house the way I sometimes do when everything is quiet. I checked the doors. Turned off the lights in rooms I hadn't used. Paused outside my daughter's old room again. Then my son's. Both doors were closed. Both rooms exactly the same as they had been the last time they visited. And for the first time, standing there in the hallway between them, I understood something I had not wanted to admit before. They hadn't stopped loving this house. They had simply stopped needing to come back to it the way they once did. And I wasn't sure yet what that meant for the way we belonged to each other now. After I stood there in the hallway between their old rooms that night, I didn't go back downstairs right away. I stayed there longer than I expected to. Not because I was waiting for something to happen. Because I was trying to understand something that had already happened. For years I had thought of their visits as something natural. Something that belonged to the shape of our family the same way weekends belonged to Saturdays and Sundays. I never imagined there would come a time when the house would feel complete even when they weren't inside it. And yet, that is exactly what had begun to happen. Not suddenly. Not painfully. Just quietly. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual again. That seemed to be happening more often. I made coffee and carried my cup to the same chair near the kitchen window where I always sat on Sundays. From there I could see the driveway clearly. There had been years when that mattered. Years when I watched for their cars without realizing I was watching. Years when I could tell which one of them had arrived just from the sound of the engine before I even stood up. That morning, I looked out at the empty driveway and felt something I hadn't felt before. Not disappointment. Something closer to acceptance. Later that afternoon, I decided to do something I had been thinking about for weeks but hadn't done yet. I called them both and invited them to dinner. Nothing special. Just dinner. The kind of dinner we used to have without planning. My daughter answered first. "I'd love to," she said. "Let me check my schedule." That sentence used to mean something different. It used to mean she would be there. Now it meant she hoped she could be there. "I understand," I told her. My son answered later that evening. "I'll try," he said. The same words. The same careful tone. "I know it's been a while," he added. "It has," I said. "That's why I thought it might be nice." There was a short pause on the phone. "I miss coming over," he said. That surprised me more than I expected. "Then come," I told him. "I will," he answered. Dinner didn't happen that weekend. Or the weekend after. There were reasons. Real ones. Work. Plans already made. Things that couldn't be moved. I believed those reasons. Still, something about the invitation stayed with me. Not because it hadn't worked. Because it had reminded me of something important. For most of their lives I had been the one who opened the door. Now they had to choose to walk through it. A few days later, I was standing in the kitchen again when my daughter called. "I'm nearby," she said. "Can I stop in for a few minutes?" "You don't have to ask," I told her. She arrived 10 minutes later. The same way she always used to. Walking in like she still belonged there. Because she did. She set her bag on the chair near the table and looked around the kitchen for a moment. "It still smells the same," she said. "What does it smell like?" I asked. "Like home," she answered. We sat together longer than either of us expected. We talked about small things at first. Work. Her neighbors. Something she was planning to do later that month. Then she looked at the calendar on the wall. "I didn't realize how long it had been since I came by," she said. "Neither did I," I answered. She looked at me for a moment after that. Not in a worried way. In a thoughtful one. "I always think I'll come next weekend," she said. "And then the weekend disappears." "I remember weekends disappearing," I told her. "They didn't used to disappear this fast," she said. "No," I agreed. "They didn't." Before she left, she walked down the hallway and opened her old bedroom door. She stood there for a minute without saying anything. "You kept everything the same," she said when she came back. "I didn't see a reason to change it," I answered. She smiled a little when she heard that. "I like that," she said. A week later, my son came by too. Later in the afternoon. The same way he used to when he still lived nearby. He stepped into the house and stopped in the hallway for a moment before coming into the kitchen. It still feels the same here, he said. That's because it is, I told him. We didn't do anything important that afternoon. We didn't fix anything. We didn't move anything. We didn't solve anything. We just sat at the kitchen table and talked. The way we used to. Not as long as before. Not as often as before. But enough. When he stood up to leave, he hesitated near the door. I should come by more, he said. You don't have to come by more, I told him. Just come by. He nodded. I will, he said. After he left, I walked back into the kitchen and looked at the table. 2 cups instead of 1. 2 chairs pulled out instead of 1. Voices still echoing in the air the way they always had after visits ended. And I understood something then that I hadn't understood before. My children hadn't stopped visiting. They had stopped visiting the way they used to. There is a difference. When they were young, they came because this house was the center of their lives. Now they came because they chose to. And choosing takes more time than belonging ever did. That night, I walked through the house again before going to bed. The hallway still looked the same. Their rooms still held the shape of their lives the way they always had. But the silence didn't feel as heavy as it once had. It felt quieter in a different way. A calmer way. For many years I thought visits were the measure of closeness. How often someone came through the door. How long they stayed. How many chairs were filled at the table. Now I understand something else. Closeness changes shape as families grow older. Sometimes it becomes phone calls. Sometimes it becomes short visits instead of long afternoons. Sometimes it becomes knowing someone could come if they needed to, even when they don't. That doesn't mean the house stopped being theirs. It just means their lives became larger than its walls. And as I stood in the kitchen that night, turning off the light before going upstairs, I realized something I hadn't expected to feel. They didn't visit the way they used to anymore. But they still knew where home was. And so did I.